Here we go. I think we'll be getting started in just a moment. We're just still waiting for a few more people to come in. We're expecting more, so we just thought we'd let those who are here and who are here on time at least into the situation and see what we all look like. And so I think we'll just get started, and I'll let people in as they come. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 post-election journalist panel discussion. It's presented by the Valley of the Sun, or Phoenix, Arizona chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, known as SPJ. SPJ is the nation's oldest and most prestigious association of news people, and more information about the society can be found at spj.org. You can learn more about our Phoenix chapter by going to Phoenix, spelled out, phoenixspj.org, where you can sign up to receive the chapter's newsletter. It contains information about chapter activities and events, such as this one. My name is Mark Scarp, the chapter secretary and moderator for tonight's event, which is being recorded for later posting and listening. I'm pleased to be joined by our chapter president, Tim Eigo, who will be assisting me this evening. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists who have graciously donated their time and knowledge to this evening's discussion. Jessica Boehm of Axios Phoenix, Laura Gersony of the Arizona Republic azcentral, Reagan Priest of the Arizona Capital Times, and Camryn Sanchez of KJZZ-FM. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. This evening is scheduled for 75 minutes, although if we need a few more minutes to wrap up, I'll extend the time long enough to do so. As such, I have questions for the panel to answer, and we'll ask them all to please keep their answers as brief as possible. Our attendees are muted, but you are welcome to submit questions directly to Tim Eigo. That's Tim, E-I-G-O is his last name, in the chat. So again, send them right to him. About halfway or 2/3 of the way through the evening, I'll turn to Tim to ask some of your questions, as many as we can get to. So panel, if we're ready, we'll begin. As you look back on your preparations to cover the 2024 elections, both the primary in July and the general in November, were you surprised by anything you didn't expect or didn't expect enough? And what was it that either surprised you that you didn't expect or didn't expect enough? Anybody can go first.
I will jump in. Hi, thanks for organizing this. I will say, so I wasn't necessarily like surprised by any outcome. I really did not. I had no idea how things were going to shake out. I told people that all the way through the election. I don't know what's going to happen, but it won't surprise me, whatever it is. I think the one thing that did kind of surprise me is I did think that regardless of who won the presidential election, that it would be close. And I was a little surprised to go to bed on election night, albeit late, and pretty much have a sense of what was going to shake out there. So I think I was probably over prepared for like weeks, if not months, of legal battles and things like that, that obviously did not come to pass. But I'll take over prepared over under prepared any day.
Yeah, I mean, I would jump off of that and say something similar. Like when people would ask me which races were going to go which way of the competitive ones that we were covering, I was never sure because they're competitive for a reason. But if anything, I was surprised by the fact that the Republicans won so across the board, like from the county to the state to the top of the ticket. Pretty much everything they could possibly have won in Arizona they got, except for Kari Lake's race. But that was one where we had also kind of had an indication that things would be a little different. So we had also, I think, at KJZZ prepared for the possibility of a lot of challenges and maybe even some repetition of 2020 with something like the audit and the fake electors, and none of that really came to pass. It was almost anticlimactic. Not that I was rooting for chaos.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think Arizona is such a unique place, and it's hard to ever think that you know exactly what's going to happen, especially with the voters here. They're way more complex than I think people often give them credit for. There definitely were some weird surprises that came up for us, especially in some of the legislative races. I think one that came to mind that we talked about in our newsroom was in the House. The State House District 17. That was a district where Dems ended up picking up a seat, and I think we were not super prepared for that, or at least hadn't really considered that. Um, and other than that, I think, yeah, there's just a lot that we did prepare for as far as like, um, all of the contingencies, and so it's hard to be surprised here.
Yeah, and for me, if it's helpful, also by way of introduction, like this was my first election cycle, covering it from start to finish. So I always felt like it was a little bit seat of my pants. I felt pretty open-ended about the whole thing. To me, the biggest surprise came in some of my exit interviews that I did with candidates who had run and then lost. I kept hearing again and again from Democrats that they would go to the doors among Democratic primary voters, like diehard Democrats, and they were hearing about immigration. And that was the moment when I really started to think, like, is this going to be a blowout? Like, is this going to be a GOP wave? Because, again and again, these candidates independently were telling me people are talking about immigration. And I always, I grew up in a politically diverse family. I always had siloed immigration as a Republican issue. And so that to me was when I really started thinking about how that issue has come to define this moment in politics. Like, I don't want to overstate it, but it has felt like the Democrats were really on the back foot on that issue in a way that cut across, to economic concerns, to all kinds of social concerns as well. Like, it really felt like the Democrats were playing defense. And I think those exit interviews for me were eye-opening and kind of firmed up that suspicion.
To that effect, Laura just talked about how Democrats found when they went to doors that immigration was on the minds of the Democratic voters they were talking to. Gauge that as you best you can, that overall mindset of the electorate this time, from the top races to the down ballot ones. I mean, compare them, if you would, to 2020 or 2022. Immigration, obviously, as mentioned by Laura, was of great concern. What other issues were of greater concern this year than in those previous elections, and which ones were of lesser concern? And why do you think that was the order changed the way they did?
The economy is huge. When I was door knocking, and unfortunately I did a lot of door knocking in the summer for some reason, I had a lot of people, independents, Republicans, and Democrats, talking to me about the economy. And, regardless of who they think is at fault for it, the fact is that things are expensive and people want change. I think that can't be overstated. I think that there was maybe some overestimation from Democrats about how much abortion would factor into voter turnout. And I think that was sort of their red meat issue, as opposed to border security being more of a Republican red meat issue initially. And I think I heard way more people talking about immigration being like front of mind than abortion. People were like, yeah, abortion's cool, but it seems like the ballot measure is going to pass. Like, that almost seemed, at least from the people I talked to, like it was like not a priority because it had sort of been addressed, and that election cycle, that news coverage had sort of died down. And I think that maybe if Democrats were banking on that, that was a key mistake.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think in 2022, Democrats were really helped by abortion as an issue. That's why they won a lot of those statewide positions that year. But I think this time around, I heard from a lot of Republicans, consultants and strategists, who said after the fact that they feel like the abortion ballot measure actually ended up boosting their results, because voters felt like they could have their cake and eat it too. They could protect abortion and then vote for Republicans to act on more conservative issues, or different issues like the economy. So I think that was definitely another place where, like Laura said, they kind of caught themselves on the back foot.
Yeah, I thought to me another top line was talk of democracy and defending democracy. I think that's an issue that, at least speaking personally for me in the press, is often top of mind because we deal with that stuff pretty regularly. You know, people are frequently hostile towards at least the paper I work for, not always me personally, but you know, so it's something I think about a lot, but really just the extent to which that did not materialize. And you know, I was not in Arizona in 2020 and 2022, but as it has been explained to me, you know, and as I read, you know, from more senior reporters, that pro-democracy axis like really pushed through, you know, after January 6th. That was top of mind to voters, and you know, Democrats put a lot of stock in that line of argument, and it really did not you know, voters did not follow through. And I must admit, I thought it might. I thought there was a really good chance that that would happen again, that like the McCain Republicans would you know, would stick would stay home or flake, so to speak. But you know, that's it. I thought the election was really a test of that theory, you know, about how much that argument resonated with voters.
I think in some ways it was maybe a reminder that like voters' memories or their capacity to feel things for long periods of time might not exist. And so, you know, like when in 2022, I think the threat to democracy, the threat to abortion, those things were so time sensitive. And they obviously helped Democrats in a year in which Democrats were not really supposed to do well historically, a midterm with a you know, fairly unpopular president. You know, they did much better than expected. And so I think Democrats were kind of riding that same wave. And it obviously like just shows that like while those of us who pay a lot of attention to things might keep that in our like very recent memory, I think for others, between having the abortion ballot measure and other things, they felt able to move on. And then the other thing is, you know, just to hit back on the economy, I don't even think it's that. I don't think anyone really offered this perfect plan on addressing the economy, but Republicans were admitting and saying like, you don't feel good, like your eggs cost more. And I think Democrats were trying to be like, no, it's okay though, because there's this, that, and this. And maybe they are correct, but people didn't feel heard. I think they didn't feel that people appreciated that they had this real, true anger about how they felt and envisioned the economy, not what it was, but how they felt it was.
Sure. Anybody else? Just a reminder to everybody, if you have a question, go into the chat and send it directly to Tim Eigo, who's going to be collecting any questions that you have. And a little later on tonight, we'll ask some of them to the panel. This year, it seemed quite noticeable that there were far fewer incidents of protests and objections to the 2024 results in Arizona than the last two elections. Why do you think that was? Certainly, if you went on social media, there were certainly enough people who still had a great deal of mistrust or distrust in the election system. But nonetheless, the outward protests and public objections to this year's results just didn't seem to have anywhere near the kind of punch that they did the last two. Why do you think that was? Why do you think that was?
I think there are still plenty of people who believe that our elections are not safe. And I think there's still plenty of candidates who would have said the same if they thought it was a winning message for them. But I think what 2022 partly proved is that it wasn't a winning message and people were getting really sick and tired of it. And it wasn't helping them win elections anymore, especially at the state level. We saw the trifecta win of Carrie Lake, Adrian Fontes, and Chris Mays over three people who ended up being election deniers and were of that ilk. And it just wasn't working for voters, but they found other stuff that did. And I went to 3 Trump rallies back to back in Arizona this election cycle. And he would sprinkle in like, oh, my election was stolen. But he really hammered on the border in particular. And he had the people riled up and it worked. And I think that it's not so much that people's beliefs changed as much as, but I think it was coming a lot from the party.
I think as well, like the people who push a lot of election denialism were some of the people who won races this year. And so that definitely helps if you believe that, you were personally wronged. I think there are still a couple of candidates in smaller races that are kind of putting out those conspiracies about their own races. But I think it does help, if you're a Republican and you won, to not want to protest those results. But yeah, to Camryn's point, I think they sort of realized where Democrats could have realized that abortion was no longer a winning issue for them, Republicans had realized that election denialism is clearly not an issue that wins them elections. And I do think Gina Swoboda, the GOP chair here, does deserve some credit for trying to push the party away from that. She did a lot of, going on social media, trying to debunk some of these conspiracies, some of these claims, or even just like confusion, especially when there was a lot of big stories surrounding the security of Arizona elections this cycle. And so I do think she definitely deserves some credit there for trying to right the ship on that.
Anyone else? Yeah, I think for me, there are two big things that come to mind. First, I think Camryn, that's a really good point. That we shouldn't take the lack of election challenges to mean that people have more faith in the election process these days. Like, I thought often about the phrase "too big to rig," the catchphrase that like still left the door open to an election challenge down the line while still explaining how Trump could win. And that leads me to the second point, which is that I think, just looking at the facts, and including facts that my newspaper and many of your papers have surfaced too, like, I think it's reasonable to ask how much people actually believed election claims that they were making publicly in 2022. That became an issue in one of the races that I was covering in the 8th district, when, text messages from Abe Hamadeh, at least his rivals were arguing, they showed he didn't actually believe the election claims that he was making publicly. Reasonable people can interpret the text messages in different ways, but I think like to me it was never clear that all the people making those claims actually believed what they were saying.
Sure. Anyone else have follow-up to that?
I think I'll just add that last week, I know a couple of us were at this press conference last week. Adrian Fontes said that he proclaimed that election denialism, the age of election denialism, is dead. And Chris Mays and Katie Hobbs sort of said, we don't know if we're so sure about that. And I think they're probably right on that. I think people still have concerns. And there were candidates like, even Democratic candidates like Tim Stringham in the Maricopa County Recorder's race who were trying to acknowledge some of those concerns. And I don't think that they'll just go away after this cycle. I think they might just take on a new life that we don't really know what will look like yet.
I agree with that. And I agree with what Reagan said earlier, that I think that if those election deniers had lost their races, we would have seen plenty of screaming and yelling and kicking of feet. So I think that the fact that they were successful is part of why it's so quiet now. And I agree with that. And I love the phrase "too big to rig" because it does account for that. It's like, if we won, it's because they were trying to get us, but we overcame that because we're so strong and we overcame their attempts to destroy us. But if we lost, it's because we were sabotaged.
That's interesting. I mean, because in 2020, for example, President Biden, his vote total was something like 8 million more votes than Donald Trump's. And so that was the result of, as some people would think, a rigged election. If they could rig it to add 8 million votes, why they couldn't overcome Trump's margin this time, which was about, what was it, 2 or 3, 2.5? What is it? At the top of my head, I can't remember. But it was not as many. Can you see what I'm saying by too big to rig? Well, if you're able to rig 8 million votes, why you couldn't do it again for Kamala Harris if you're in the rigging business or whatever? I wish I had the answer to that too, but I don't. Okay, well, let's just move on then. So now that the smoke is clearing, and what do you think that the state leaders of the state Democrats and Republicans' next moves might be, as they are obviously going to be planning for the next election, and to set policy and to try and affect policy in the near term?
I mean, I know we're hearing, partially because Cap Times is pretty focused on, the Capitol and the legislature. I know we're hearing that a lot of the focus is being turned to this next legislative session and what wins they can take from that to bring into the next election cycle. I know particularly for the governor, that's going to be really important. And people on both sides are talking about what wins she'll need to bring to a reelection campaign. So I know a lot of focus is being turned toward what happens in 2025, especially because there's a lot of issues that they're going to have to address during this legislative session in particular, that can't wait till 2026. So I think that's going to be a important thing that they'll have their eye on.
I know that sometimes people think water is a snooze fest topic, but it's one of my favorite topics, and I'm a water nerd. So I really hope that people pay attention to water this year, because we've got some really big issues coming up. We've got an ag to urban proposal. We've got AMA fights. We've got rural versus urban. We've got ag versus water. We've got the Colorado River negotiations coming up. And some of that will be litigated at the legislature, as it were. Some of it will take place on a county level. Some of it will take place at the federal level. I know water's complex, but I'm very excited for the future of water in this upcoming year or two.
Do you think, Camryn, that because we had a wetter year this past year, 2023, 2024, that water kind of moved off a lot of people's radar because, oh, look, Lake Mead is filling up again and it's not so bad and things like that?
I just think that water's not a sexy topic. I just think that, like, it's not like abortion, for example. I think that they literally fall asleep. I was at a water hearing last week that lasted for 7 hours. Nobody wants to hear about that. And nobody knows the alphabet soup of the CAGR is considering the ADA's proposal or the OMWA's meeting with the ADWR and the GERC. Like, it's awful. It's awful, but it's so necessary. And I feel like water can only become more important to people as the situation escalates.
Yeah, and kind of to go off of that, I know this is jumping around a bit, but I think one of the issues that I was like, because I also cover the Corporation Commission for Cap Times, and Democrats are trying really hard to make climate change a big issue in that race. And I do feel like, at least in 2020, especially among younger voters, that was such a big issue. They wanted the Biden campaign to address that. They wanted some action on that. And it's been funny to watch that kind of drop off, especially in Arizona, where we have big issues like water, and like are currently experiencing the impacts of climate change. And so it was interesting to see those kinds of issues, which again, really not sexy. A lot of them are like, it's very nitty-gritty policy stuff, but it does have an immediate impact on our lives. And for whatever reason, that message really did not resonate with voters, especially in that Corp.com race.
I think it's one of those issues that, people don't pay a huge amount of attention to it unless they, go to their sink and turn something on and nothing comes out. Then it becomes the number one issue, but we're not there. So any other thoughts about where the major parties are going to be trying to head these next couple of years?
One thing I will say that I am hopeful for, I don't know if it will actually come to pass if I'm being realistic with myself, but it probably helps to have like some background, as I, prior to joining Axios, was the housing and homelessness reporter at the Republic for several years. And so I am hopeful that, given the attention to the economy, especially as it relates, I think often when people talk about housing concerns in a national scope, they're talking about interest rates are really high and things like that. But obviously, that is only one part of a much bigger problem we have in Arizona and nationally, as it relates to housing shortages. And the legislature has made efforts to address and make it easier to build and things like that. But I mean, I think most people who are in the development world would tell you that they were pretty not that helpful changes. I mean, I'm sure they'll take what they can get, but I think there is capacity and public appetite for real changes to both our existing regulations that make it difficult to build, and also additional funding and capacity for those more traditional, LIHTC and other low-income type developments. And so I'll be interested with the attention that was paid to housing during this election cycle, if that actually translates into anything realistic or actually helpful in the legislative session. And obviously cities play a huge role in that as well. And so we'll see how they react or don't to all of this. And also, sorry, I just remembered this, but with the passing of Proposition 312, like how cities address urban camping and homelessness, street homelessness specifically, I think is going to be really an interesting thing to watch. I think we're seeing homelessness become this bigger issue that, I think people blame certain parties or certain politicians for, and like my hope always is that we can have a broader conversation about some of those root causes, and how all levels and layers of government can be a part of the solution on that.
Oh, if there's time, just one other theme that I'll be watching. And I cover federal politics for the Republic, and I primarily focus on our U.S. House delegation. And one thing I'm really curious about, is that a lot of times, the interests of Arizona districts seem like they could come into conflict with parts of President Trump's agenda. So obviously that goes on both sides of the aisle. Like that was true for Democrats too when Biden, during Biden's administration. But now that Republicans are in power, like I'm kind of curious, to look at our Republican members of Congress, like when push comes to shove, when they have to take a vote, when Juan Ciscomani, whose border economy depends quite a bit on trade with Mexico, when push comes to shove, how is he going to vote or comment on issues like trade, when Trump wants to impose pretty steep tariffs on his own district. There's innumerable questions. And again, I think that was true for Democrats. It'll now be true for Republicans, but those are just one theme and a type of tension that I'll be following in the new year.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how our border coverage shifts, because I consider myself, Laura, Reagan, and Jessica to be like state reporters. But now that Trump's in office, he's made all these pledges about what he's going to do with the border at the federal level. And I think maybe when it comes to like dropping bills at the state legislature, the Republicans can kick their feet up a little bit because he'll be carrying out that agenda. But I'm very interested to see what that looks like in Arizona. Is he really going to finish building the wall? How long is that going to take? Where is he going to start? Are there going to be fights over it? Are they going to take place in court? Are they going to be deporting people out of their houses in Phoenix? What does that look like? So I think that inevitably we'll still be covering the border, just in a different sort of way.
Yeah, you bring up a good point with the deportation messaging. It's unclear what that will actually look like, but if it does look like what the president-elect has described, I think it'll have some really real-world economic impacts on, not beyond obviously the human impacts that we know would occur, but the economic impacts on people who might not think that they will be impacted, I think could be severe. And I think that's a really important thing for us to be watching.
After a surge in registrations of independents earlier this year, sometime starting the last half of this year, Arizona started to see increases in registrations for the two major political parties again, most notably the Republican Party. Do you see voters going back to the parties, or do you think during the next 2 years there be another surge in independent voters? Is that the way things are going to head ultimately, with more independents and fewer party registrants as the new normal?
I at least in Arizona, I don't see that. I don't see voters going back to parties. I think, if anything, the election results we have showed that the voters here tend to skew a little bit more independent. They vote for Republican candidates, but also vote for abortion. I think that kind of surge, especially for Republicans, is really due to the kind of crazy voter registration apparatus that they were utilizing through Turning Point. And I think, I'm hearing more and more on both from people in both parties that they're just not satisfied with like what they would consider the mainstream party. And that includes at the state level. I mean, I've been seeing a lot even today of Democrats expressing frustration over statewide Democrats reelecting the chair of the Arizona Democratic Party. They think that, she should be ousted. We need some new blood. We need to, this was an admonishment on her leadership, that sort of thing. But then, on the Republican side, there are also Republicans, whether that's in the middle or kind of on the fringes, who are also getting irritated with like the ruling class of Republicans. Some think they're not doing enough. They're not pushing hard enough on conservative causes. And some, think that they're maybe going a little too far. So I just think that more and more voters find themselves not aligning with either party. And I think being an independent, especially in Arizona, gives them a lot more political leeway.
One thing that I don't have like I guess an answer to like the very specific part of your question, but one thing I'll say generally about Arizona independence, and I have to like kind of say this all the time as I talk with folks that work for my company in other states or with our national team, is like I think there's like some like magical thing that like has been created about Arizona independence. And I like to remind people that like I wouldn't say most, but like there's a good portion of independents who are partisan people. They just like, there's something about like the idea of labels we hate in Arizona. We don't want to be labeled. We want to, chart our own course. It's this like libertarian Western thing we've got. And I kind of get it because I'm in Arizona and I probably feel that way too. But I do think it's important as we look at independence, that doesn't always mean that like people are more moderate. Like it's really hard to like use them as a judgment call. And I think like you saw that with like Kyrsten Sinema, right? She's an independent. If independents are this like incredible force we say that they are, she should have been able to run and be successful. Obviously, that's not like independents are not voting for independent candidates. And I think that it's just really important as we have these conversations to remember that like there are some people who are independent because the GOP doesn't go far enough for them. And there are some people that are independent because they are far left of the current Democratic Party. So it's an important reminder that they don't stand for one thing or they're not a monolith group. I think we've kind of created this like narrative about them that it doesn't always turn out to be true.
You think, Jessica, that so long as, and obviously that was the result of two ballot propositions on the matter this time, we're kind of still have the system we have with primaries. So long as the overwhelming majority of independents do not participate in primaries, even though they're allowed to, even under the strictures that we have now, where you have to pick a party ballot and vote it. As long as independents still are avoiding that, will they ever have that? Will the moderate independent ever be able to rise? Or I mean, what have you heard about that? That they're a big group, but as you pointed out, they tend to be very partisan. They just don't sign up as partisan.
They just don't want you to know. No,
They don't want you to know.
No, and I should say that like there is also like a legitimate moderate independent part of that group too. And you are correct. Those folks have a hard time like breaking through because of current systems. And I mean, obviously that's why you saw the group that ran the proposition to change the way that we do our primaries. And like their argument was, we're going to get more moderate folks if we open this up to, and I don't think it's only opening it up so independents feel included, but I think there's also like probably some moderate Democrats who would maybe cross the aisle and some moderate Republicans who would cross the aisle, but they can't do that in the current structure. And so the idea is that it would have created this more moderate candidate base. I mean, obviously it didn't pass, so we'll never know if that actually came to pass. But yeah, under the current primary system, it is hard for moderates in, you know, with the exception of like moderate swing districts. Like if you're in a, you know, pretty significantly conservative or Republican or liberal district, or if you're running a statewide race, it's hard for a moderate candidate to win in the primary. It just is. It always has been. So.
Well, the way some of the studies have come out is that so long as the way that our primaries have evolved, which is that voter turnout is not very high. You get what, 25, maybe 30%. And that when those people who have turned out are studied, they tend to be in the Democratic primary, the most left-leaning people in the Democratic Party. And in the Republican Party, they tend to be the most right-leaning people in the Republican Party. So when you run in a primary, you've got to appeal to those folks, even if you're not yourself. And then what you see is somebody, a lot of partisan kind of rhetoric during the primary, and the emerging candidate goes to the general, suddenly you see them moving toward the center. And to be able to get somebody beyond the base. So that's kind of, as the studies have shown and the experience has shown, that's kind of how it's been. And you know, is there any possibility that is going to change under the current system, or are we just going to have that until unless the voters change their minds, which they didn't do this time, they voted to leave things the way they are.
Yeah. And I do think that there was a lot of confusion with having two similar ballot propositions and everything. I don't think that would have maybe changed the result, but you know, it was a weird situation. But I also think like the one time that like having an active state party who keeps like people out of those primaries, like you saw, like I often wonder if Reagan Priest had been in a legitimate primary, like would he have had to go further to the left, and would that have made it more difficult for him when he got to the general? I don't know. And that's when it really pays off to have a strong state party being like, no, like we're not going to do that. We're going to focus on the general. And, you know, that doesn't always work, but, you know, I think those are the cases in which it does, is when you have that person run opposed or run against someone who just isn't going to make enough of a difference for them to change their positions or express their more liberal or conservative views.
Any thoughts by any of the other panelists on the subject of independent voters?
I'm going to say, oh yeah.
Go ahead, Camryn, go ahead.
I think this is sort of what Jessica's saying in different words. I often say that independents are independent for different reasons. And I think that it is a fallacy for people who think, okay, so there's about 30% Republicans, 33% independents, 30% whatever it is in Arizona. So that means there's 1/3 to the left, 1/3 to the right, and 1/3 smack dab in the middle. No. Independents are all independent for different reasons, and they're not a homogenous group of people who hang out and coordinate stuff together. That doesn't mean they're voting for independent candidates at all. They could be people who lean libertarian. They could be people who lean Green Party, no labels. We don't know. And it's hard to appeal to them. And I think it is a big mistake to consider them this chunk of moderates. That's not at all the case. As for the ballot measures that failed, I agree that they kind of had a perfect storm against them. There were two measures, one competing against another. They were confusing, they were long-winded, and they were faced by opposition from both major parties. So if you're taking your cue as a Democrat or a Republican from your party, or who they recommend that you vote for, or the golden ticket or anything like that, everyone and their brother was against the open primaries initiative, and no one was really advocating for it. And so I think it was just pretty much doomed. Will it come back? Maybe. The proponents told me they want to bring it back, but I don't see how it survives because it's always going to be under those conditions. Something else would have to change.
It has been successful in a few other states. I don't know how they successfully did it there. I don't know enough about it. Maybe you do. Any of you know any of the other states where they have an open primary similar to the one that the failed proposition. Was it 140 anticipated?
I think other states had similar ideas of creating what Arizona tried to this year and mostly got shot down, is my understanding. I know that Alaska, for example, had established one a while ago, and I think that scared a lot of major parties. And I think that gave them the strength to run a concerted effort because they were like, oh, hey, if you change the way that we run our primaries, we're not going to get our same candidates through. And that's going to mess everything up for us. And we don't want the challenge in the competition.
Understood.
And I was
Anybody
just-
else? Go ahead,
I was
please.
just gonna say, this is neither here nor there, but like in covering politics, I am occasionally surprised by what issues actually gain traction. Usually I think like I can kind of see it coming, and generally if you talk to enough voters, you can kind of predict what the next issue cycle is going to be, or at least you can smell it, like you can recognize it when an issue comes up and you say, oh yeah, this has the stuff like where it could become a news cycle or 2 news cycles. I was not predicting ranked choice voting to become a hot button issue. That was an issue that like I found out about in college, where some nerd, like political science nerds, were talking about like the theory behind ranked choice voting and how you get different outcomes depending on how you like. To me, that's just such a wonky thing, but I think it, and I can kind of armchair theorize. Like I bet the reason why it's an issue is because loyalty to I guess both parties, I hear it particularly on the right. So I would guess, loyalty to Trump is a big factor and a big reason why that's seen as a threat to Republicans. But that is just one of those issues that I guess I've been surprised, where people always say we want a moderate. They say we want a maverick, especially in Arizona. But, like Jessica said, they got one in Kyrsten Sinema, and then they rejected her and she became like a, historically unpopular figure in politics. So that I find that whole, nexus of issues like kind of counterintuitive and interesting.
Well, also, it seems in our polarized times, one thing the Democratic and Republican parties represent is a very clear choice. If you believe belief 1, you're going to go with them. If you believe 2, you're going to go with them. And the parties represent very clearly that you each have their own color, red and blue. And if you are a polarized voter, which so many people are, the parties are a great haven for you. You don't have to live in that murky world of the independent or any other party for that matter, because these people are a haven for you. They're your tribe, they're your hangout, and you support their candidates. So perhaps reform may not come until, the time of polarization has morphed to something else. We don't know what that might be, but what do you think of that thought?
That checks out to me.
Well, good. Tim, I think Tim signaled to me he's got a couple of questions for you from our audience, and so I'll turn it over to him.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. Boy, what a great conversation. So, heads up, I wrote down about 60 questions for you. So we'll be here till about 11 p.m. So no, we got some great questions. I'm going to start with one of my own though, which is, there are 3 events, covering campaigns is often like a lot of the same thing over and over. There's the stump speeches don't change, of course, but there were 3 events that I'm curious, as you talk to potential voters, did these events have more effect on their sentiment, less effect on their sentiment than you would have guessed? One is the sudden shift from Biden to Harris. The other is the Trump assassination attempt. And the third is Gaza. So take any one of those. Did it have an effect when you were talking to people? Was it a moment in voters' decision making, or was it kind of more of the same?
Weirdly enough, I want to say around the beginning of October, it sort of felt like everything that had happened prior to this year was kind of people had already moved on. At least from some of the voters I had talked to, especially given, the Trump assassination and Biden stepping down. I think for a lot of people, it was kind of just like some of it has to do with, just how fast our news cycle goes and how many more issues had come up since then. But a lot of people were focused on other things. Like we mentioned, they were more focused about, the economy, like what, the kitchen table issues, like that kind of stuff that has more of an impact on their daily lives seemed to be more top of mind, the further away we got from those events. And that felt really interesting to watch, especially because I got to a point where I was like, I realize I like haven't heard anyone talk about like these crazy things that happened just a few months ago. Nobody's bringing that up anymore. And it was just a weird thing to realize. And I feel like I'm realizing it all over again, just listening to your question. Like those things felt so huge in the moment, but I don't know, it's been a crazy election cycle. And especially in Arizona, there were so many things here, specifically locally, that kept happening. That I felt like people just kind of, voters had their short memory, like Jessica mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Anybody else on that?
I would say the
There's-
Trump, yeah,
Go ahead, Camryn.
I would say the Trump assassination attempt was a huge rally point for his base. I think it was hugely beneficial to him. I mean, he almost died, so that's terrible, but I think that people saw him under threat and then get up and say fight, which was the exact right thing for him to do in that moment. And it was like such a frenzy, and going to his rallies, they made sure to hone in on that. And it's like, they tried to kill me and I'm here, and they were like pushing it with the merch and stuff. I had multiple people, strangers at Trump rallies, who tell me that they think he was chosen by God and protected by angels, literally, not figuratively. Like a lot of people see him as this messiah figure and this martyr and this hero, and they're trying to get him, and he's trying to stand up for us, and he looked brave. And so, yeah, I just think that, that moment was a boost.
Well, that's exactly what my mom says about me, so I get it. I get it.
It's funny because like at the time it happened, I thought all of that. And I remember being like, well, that's the ball game, like because not only all of the things you're saying, but I think what I thought is that like it gave Republicans even though like the realities of the situation were nuanced and everything, it gave them what they've been saying, which is like, under Democrats, things are chaotic, they are unsafe, and look, on this national stage, the former president was almost killed. I mean, it was a hugely unsettling moment I think for everyone. And I mean, it was my birthday, and it just kind of threw me into a state of shock. And I thought that was going to be such a like decision point, and I was shocked at how, and I mean, that was happening as Biden's dropping out of the race, and we have a new presidential candidate and everything else, and I was just shocked at how quickly, like, obviously his base was very fired up by it throughout, but I don't think it became like this. I don't think that is the reason he won. I think everybody we just kept moving on from everything. Like there were moments of just chaos and excitement and everything. You think about like once Harris was the nominee, and the convention was such a this energetic moment, and I was like, wow, this feels like a big moment. And then like a month later, it was like, oh, everybody's kind of like, who is she and what is she doing? Nobody like held on to these threads. Everything just kept happening. And I think I also feel shocked that these things did not have a truer, bigger impact. I don't know.
Yeah.
And then national coverage suggests that the Democrats hurt themselves with their own base about their positioning on Gaza. Did you hear that from Arizonans? Was Gaza an important conversation point for them?
I think I heard it a bit. I will say I don't think it was like I think for the voters that it was an issue for, it was one of their larger issues. But I don't think it was something that was far reaching enough. I know it feels like ages ago, but during the presidential primary here, there was that effort to vote non-committed, and to sort of send a message to Biden when he was still the nominee. And so I think like that stuff has definitely been on the periphery of voters, but I definitely was not something that like penetrated deeply enough, I think, to like really have much of an impact on how Democrats performed here.
Yeah,
Excellent.
and I
I'll
think,
tell, oh, go ahead. Yeah,
well,
Laura,
I
go
was just
ahead.
gonna say, I thought like in a way that set this election apart from 2020. Like after 2020, you could reasonably ask, like, did Jill Stein cost wait, oh no, sorry, 2016, sorry. Like, you know, did Jill Stein like cost Hillary Clinton the election? You could like reasonable people could argue. But I think in this case, the margins, the fact that it was up and down the ballot, that it was every demographic swung towards Republicans, in a way has made me, and this is just more personally rather than in my capacity as a reporter, but I just think you have to kind of take the simplest explanation, like, which is that it's not, you know, if Kamala Harris had tweaked her message slightly, it's hard for me to imagine that she could have won. Even if they'd had a different candidate, very hard for me to imagine the election could have gone differently. To me, it was really a question of vision, that the Republican Party has quite a clear explanation, whether you agree or disagree with it. They are quite clear about what's wrong with American society today. For the Democrats, it feels very jumbled. And I think really it came down to that. Like, it was just, I almost see it like as if we're looking at an election in history, you know, when you think less about the nuts and bolts and the, you know, single day or week by week news cycles, and more just about the wider economic and like social forces at play. Like, it's very hard for me to imagine that even those issues that felt like a big deal, you know, would have changed this election result.
Fair enough. So I can tell you that there are a number of, there are questions in the chat, but there are also some statements. So I'm not going to get into the statements, but I will say that we just had maybe a fact check mark. So let me offer this. Someone here says, questioning the idea that there was kind of a lowish turnout, and said that eligible to vote this year, 224 million, 150 million voted. And I don't do math, but he says that's 67% voted. What are you all hearing about the turnout this year? Just so we get that fact straight.
Are we talking
Was
general or primary? Because I think we all agree that the primary turnouts are generally quite low.
Yes, I think we're talking general.
I mean, for Arizona, I think our general is decent. For a presidential election year, it's usually a higher turnout.
All right. Fair enough. I just want to make sure. Yeah, so the turnout was decent. So thank you, Alan, for the comment. One question here, and I don't know if you can tell us your viewpoint. Did any of you expect there to be a stronger female power kind of message coming from the campaign for the potential first female president? She kind of chose not to lean into that. And statistically, do you think are female voters showing up as you expected? Yeah, Camryn.
Okay, well, first I wanted to say that I agree with Laura and Jessica about the earlier thing. I don't think that any one of those particular 3 moments could have necessarily swayed the outcome of the presidential election. They're just moments. When it comes to Harris, I think it was smart for her to not campaign on that. I think Hillary Clinton did a bit of that, and I think it was generally like understood after her race to maybe have been a bad idea. The whole girl power thing, I think Republicans sometimes interpret it as vote for me because I'm a girl. And that's why people should vote for me. And I think that's an off-putting message, even if it's not how that is meant. I went to 3 Harris rallies as well, and she was very consistent about not saying that, about not being like, isn't it cool that I would be the first female president? And I think that with independents and Republicans, that's probably the right idea.
Yeah, I agree. I think especially in Arizona voters, that's not a message that would resonate with them. I mean, we're on our 5th female governor. We've had women elected to statewide positions, to all sorts of positions in Congress. Like, that's just not something that voters here care that much about. Obviously, in other states, you can't say the same. But I think for Arizona voters in particular, like that kind of message, if she had tried to play into that, I don't think it would have worked very well. Again, I think voters are just not that interested in that kind of messaging.
I have like the what is it, like Rachel something, the fight song that like Hillary Clinton like really campaigned heavy on. Like, it's like playing in my head right now as you ask this question. But I think like the long and short of it is like, and I think enough time has passed, the Democrats might have done some reflecting on, I don't think Hillary ran a great campaign. And I think part of it was that. And I think maybe to the extreme, Kamala Harris went the other way and was like, we're not going to mention this at all. And, you know, I don't think like, I don't know. I don't think like an occasional mention is like gonna kill you with voters or anything, but I think it was just like, we are not going to be Hillary Clinton. Like, I think that's the long and short of it.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I felt, you know, the Harris campaign did not mention that, but the GOP attacks worked. Like the GOP attacks framing them as being focused on identity politics really did land, which, you know, to me, I interpreted as just that's what voters associate the Democratic Party with, that there's no other simpler explanation, you know, like Republicans are offering. You know, whether or not they use that issue, they were defined by it, I thought.
Very true.
And sometimes I wonder, I think Democrats like to view women as a demographic that they'll always clinch, but I think we've seen when Trump runs, white women vote for Trump. And so they can't always bank on, you know, running as a female-led candidate. And then they also do kind of have to field those attacks from the GOP that like, this is, you know, this is DEI at work. This is what Democrats believe in, that sort of thing. Especially when it comes to someone like Kamala Harris. And so I think, you know, relying on women as a reliably Democratic demographic is just not something that we can do anymore.
And I think to that point, a lot was made of this supposed to be like the boys versus girls election. And I think it goes back to what we discussed earlier, that abortion did not end up being the motivating vote on things other than abortion initiatives. And I think that was like, you know, one of those, you know, just misunderstandings of where women were at.
Really
So
quickly, Tim, before you go on to the next
Mark.
one,
Yeah.
I just did a little research while you were talking and while everyone's answering. I went to ballotpedia.org. According to them, the Arizona turnout in just a month ago in November in 2024 was 63.6%. That compares to 68.6% in 2020. So that's a drop of 5 points from 4 years ago. Nationally, in 2020, the national turnout was 66.6%, and this year it was 63.7%. So a drop of almost 4 points nationally. So while both are number one and number two in terms of turnout, going back 20 years, this election was slightly less of a turnout than the one in 2020, according to Ballotpedia.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Very cool. So we have an interesting question. You know, we often talk about generational differences in voters. In your reporting, did you see any generational commonalities? What are both young Americans and older Americans commonly concerned about?
I mean, affordability, right? That pretty much transcends age, I would say. Young people want to be able to afford houses. Like most of my friends can't and don't. And it seems so unattainable, and it's scary and frustrating. And people who are seniors who are maybe looking towards retiring or already have are scared too. And, you know, people who are in the middle, you know, if they're having families and stuff, you've got to pay for education and food, and everything is expensive. And I think that that's scary. It's the ultimate kitchen table issue. Like we said about abortion, it's not really a kitchen table issue. People are not going and getting abortions every day, unless you've got some, well, no, I don't think that's possible. But you are having to buy stuff every day. You have to get gas, you have to get groceries. And so I think that that's probably the one that comes to mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think across the age spectrum, the economy was really important. I think that doesn't mean that those different age demographics agree on how, like, what the best course of action would be. You know, and I don't think that, you know, indicates how they were going to vote, but I think it was something that was so concerning for everybody. And I agree. Yeah, it's something that, being younger, that's something that my friends and I talk about all the time is, affording things in the future. And so I do think that that was interesting to see how that transcended the age demographic. But again, I do think when you get deeper into demographics of young men versus young women, older men versus older women, that's where you start to see the differences of we agree on these topics, but we might not necessarily agree on who can deliver on those issues and what the best avenue to deliver on those issues would be.
I think I was surprised a little bit by, and you kind of saw this coming, so I wasn't surprised about it in the results, but I've been surprised over the last year or so that I think I think there's more, I think young people have more, share more concerns with older generations than we thought they did. I think everybody was like, Gen Z is this whole new thing, and they, only care about the environment or whatever. And it just hasn't really come to pass as reality. And I think I was surprised, especially, and this, may differ between genders, but I mean, young men, especially, I think the identity politics stuff, they held similar views to older men and women. And so I think I've been surprised that the generations are not as politically defined, I think, as we made them out to be, maybe even 2 or 4 years ago.
So another question. So yeah, you don't have to reveal if you don't want, if you're reporting, if you were caught on your own back foot with this, but did the results of the trends of the Hispanic vote, did that align with the conversations you were having with potential voters through the fall, or did it surprise you?
It did not really surprise me. I think we had seen that in polling all year long, that Latinos were very unhappy with Biden. And then when the switch was made, she didn't poll well, especially with Latino men. And so I mean, maybe it was more than I expected, but it did not surprise me. I think Latino voters have been telling Democrats that they're unhappy for a while or unheard. And it was up, they didn't listen.
So the consensus, it looks like I see a lot of nods.
I remember that I was talking about this on the radio before the election. The question was something about how Democrats are doing with Latinos, and I said something similar to what Jessica did, which is what we were seeing in polling and such. And I remember someone angry called into the radio station and they're like, "Your reporter's stupid. She doesn't know anything because Latinos love Democrats." And I was like, okay. And then surely enough, I don't know. I guess I was right.
I also think it's so important to remember, just as we talked about with independents and all of these other demographics, Latino is a huge demographic, of very, very diverse from all different countries, and to paint them all as one way is just a fatal mistake.
Now, we have a number of questions that I put in a category of questions about journalism. So that's not really your beat, but I'll put it out there anyway, and maybe you have viewpoints or maybe viewpoints of what you heard from people you interviewed. Do you feel the national election coverage was slanted to one candidate or another?
I feel like that's such a hard question to answer when you spend so much time consuming media. I don't know. I think it's hard as well. You also have to give the credit where credit is due, that national media a lot of times has reporters on the ground in certain areas. So sometimes, they are doing their best to cover from every angle, and sometimes, they're not here and they're not getting the sides of every story. But yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for whether or not I think they were partial to one side or the other. I think it also depends on like which topic we're talking about, which story we're talking about. Again, because there were so many different things that happened this year. And yeah, I also think it's sometimes hard to answer that question when I spend so much time on Twitter, or X as it were.
Understood. Let me ask you this. Jessica at the top mentioned the preparation for legal challenges before the election, and then they didn't pan out this time. Given the, well, I don't want to talk about age, but I suspect if there were a lot of older reporters here tonight, they might say they didn't really cover election challenges much, occasionally. And now I wonder, do you see that it's generally just a part of the beat? And is it a part that drives you crazy and you're happy you didn't have to deal with in this election? Because it seems so common now that elections also mean covering courts. Camryn, I see you nodding.
Yes. Yeah, I would say that's fair. I think especially in Arizona, I think it's less, of a frenzy maybe in some other states, like I talked to my family in the Bay Area, which is the most liberal place to ever liberal. And I'm like, here we've got candidates openly saying if my election, fails, it's because it was stolen. And they're like, that's crazy. But it's not crazy for me because I've been dealing with it for the past few years of my work here. And yeah, it absolutely became a beat. I mean, it's the subject of so much we have to cover, and it's worth covering because it became the new norm, and we were at the center of so much of it for the entire country to watch.
Yeah, and I'll shout out at Cap Times, we have a courts reporter, Kira Riley. She's great at what she does, and she was prepping a lot for election challenges, what that would look like. Talking to a lot of sources about what they were expecting, and I think for the most part in Arizona, everyone was expecting lots of election challenges, whether that was to like individual races, to some of the props, all of that kind of stuff, and it just didn't pan out. And so, it's one of those things where, I think a lot of people were expecting it, so it does feel weird that there's like not a whole lot of coverage coming from that. But really there's just not, at least this time around, it didn't work that way. I mean, I know at one point, like the Maricopa County Superior Court was like planning to stay open late and extending hours and doing all this stuff to prepare for these challenges. But again, it just didn't happen the way that we thought it would. And I think, for people who have courts as their beat or people who cover elections, I think that's something we can be a little bit grateful for. But yeah, it's a lack of coverage does not necessarily mean, a lack of due diligence on our part. It sometimes just means things don't pan out the way we thought they would.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Jessica, or no, Laura, go ahead. Yeah, because I'm curious whether it's become like because a lot of reporters can go through a career and cover a court case, once or twice. And now, if your beat is elections, you got to understand this stuff. So, Laura, what were you going to say?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say that I think this gets to how, and I say this really in a non-judgmental way, more an analytical way, that the GOP has made institutions the story. Like they've made, started talking about the media, about media norms. They've started talking about elections or about, questioning the scientific establishment. And I think, Tim, I'm still sort of chewing on your earlier question about media bias, because I think like the media norm is to, for example, fact check something by comparing what the candidate said to the consensus, to the scientific consensus on an issue. And that is no longer seen, that's no longer widely seen as like an okay, like a kosher practice. Like there are a lot of people who would be skeptical of that, framing that as a fact check. So, and I think, the same is true when it comes to elections, like that, the institution is the story, that the election administration, what used to be a total snooze fest of a beat, like certifying the election, is now where the action happens. To me, it's part of that wider theme.
That's great, Laura. And if I could, Laura, if I could jump on what you just said, 15 years ago, everybody did fact checking, but there was no beat called fact checking. And now it's a common thing. But do you think it's run its course? I mean, are people over fact checks? Because, you know, reporters can spend hours and hours and hours on this kind of thing, and voters are like, yeah, whatever. I don't know.
I know. I don't know either. And what I will say is that I think there are like two registers. Like I think sometimes there's two ways to approach something like that. Like on the one hand, there's the scolding fact check register. On the other hand, there's an effort to understand why someone believes what they do. And those are like two very different tonalities, I guess, that I always think about when I'm writing a story, like where it kind of feels like you have to choose like which tone of voice you're going to be writing in. And I think to me that is a genuinely tough problem. It's genuinely a difficult problem about which tone to use and how much to be trying to be like the parent, like setting the record straight versus understanding how people come to view things the way they do. And I don't know, I see that as a really tricky problem.
I love that distinction. Anybody else? Any thoughts on fact checking?
I totally agree. And I would say that I think to also circle back on the media bias element, I don't think I think most journalists never have like an intention of being biased, but I do think that sometimes we take that tone because it's like, well, this is how it is. This is the scientific reality, or this is the data reality. And I think maybe we need to have a little bit of like a personal reflection of like, how do we like listen to what we believe is like not an accurate source of information and be able to understand why people feel that it may be, and help them to understand or help to explain why these sources of information are coming to different conclusions. And I think having those better conversations would lead to better outcomes for everyone. But people don't like to be told that like, no, you're dumb and your source of information is bad and stupid. Like your brain is literally going to block that information. Like it's like a psychological thing. So like, how do we have better conversations? How do we write these stories in a more understanding and sympathetic way, that there's a lot of information out there that sometimes people don't understand? Is like, people have every good intention of educating themselves, and like, how do we make sure that the information we're using is also, you know, the gold standard, and how do we prove that to people? Like, I think we need to do a lot more work than just being like, you're wrong, 5 Pinocchios. Like, you know, it's not helping anyone. So.
Agreed. Mark, I see you nodding. In a way that suggests there's a hook coming. So I think we're coming up in an hour 15. Could I just ask a question, as you know, a reporter question? What story from the fall do you wish you had had more time to cover? Or was it one you really enjoyed and wish you could have dug into more?
Crypto. There was so much money spent by the cryptocurrency, which, love it or hate it, like, but it was so much money. I mean, the amount of money I still find staggering. Like, I think it was, as I crunched the numbers, I don't want to misstate this, either a fifth or a sixth of the independent expenditures in the races all of the congressional races, I believe, in Arizona. That's like so much money, you know, and yet it is a niche issue for many voters. So that's my issue.
Yes, and somebody just shot a question in. Who gets that money? And I'll say, and Alan, thank you for the question. It's a good one, although you guys will have an answer to this, but I think it was all over the board. I mean, in our house, we were looking at our ballot, and somebody was like, we saw all this reporting about this one candidate has gotten a lot of crypto money. Is that a troubling sign? And then once the primary was done, the person who prevailed was getting a lot of crypto money. So they both got a lot of crypto money. I don't know. Laura, what do you think? Who's getting the money?
Yeah, no, I agree. It is not straightforward. It's on both sides of the aisle. It's also, I don't know, I have heard from some perspectives within the crypto industry, like there's a lot of infighting among crypto advocates, that some parts think others are totally unsophisticated, and like some see themselves as the adults in the room. And I find it actually like kind of entertaining. So I think that's one reason why like it's a bit hard to read, you know.
Jessica, do you have a notion about the crypto? And then you can get back to my original question is, what do you wish you got to cover more? Whichever you want to answer.
I'll just quickly say on crypto, like I could not stand the irony of like I wrote at some point about like, you know, I think it was who I don't even remember the candidates, but oh, it was Yasemin Ansari had gotten all this crypto money, and the progressives were like, this is terrible because their candidate, Raquel Tehran, like didn't. And then after like then Ruben Gallego got a ton of this from the same pack, and everybody was like, ugh, not gonna pay attention to that. Like, anyways, it drives hypocrisy, not my favorite thing. But real quickly, I'll say one thing it's not that I even wish I had more time on. I wish that I could be here and then go back in time and have the foresight that I do now. But like, I wish I understood more how the kind of what Reagan was mentioning earlier, how the abortion measure might actually hurt Democrats because of the like having and eating the cake situation. And I think that would have been a fascinating thing to explore. Like, should that initiative have been tried the year before? Like, was there other things that could have been done? Because the whole conversation was, oh, this is going to help Democrats. It's going to drive turnout. And obviously that just like was not the case. And I wish I would have had that foresight, because I think it's a fascinating one.
Wow, excellent. Reagan, any thoughts on what you would cover?
Yeah, I'll say I spent some time, I call it my little side quest that I went on this fall, is like a stress relief story from election coverage. But I spent some time covering log cabin Republicans in Arizona, which if you're not familiar, that's LGBTQ Republicans. And that's a demographic that's really fascinating to me. It's really fast growing here. And they're hoping to have a lot of political influence in the state. And they also tend to vote for Trump and tend to be Trump supporters, which a lot of people find, to be not in their best interests, whether you think that's true or not. And that's a demographic that I think, when we were talking earlier about the fact that like the further down you get into these demographics, people are not just young or old. They might be young, they might be Black, they might be, there's all these different identities that people can have, and those can really impact how they vote and why they vote. And so that's something that I could probably spend 100 years writing and researching about. And hopefully something we'll get to write more about as they continue to grow and hopefully have a little bit more say in the Republican Party as they hope to. So.
I love that, Reagan. It occurs to me as you were talking that the GOP hates the notion of intersectionality because, well, for numerous reasons, and yet they benefited tremendously from the true fact that people are intersectional. So there you go. Thank you.
Yes. Well,
Camryn, any thoughts? Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure, Camryn, or wanted to make sure they each got a chance.
oh, sure, please do. Yes.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
No, I wanted to make sure that. Was
Well-
there anything else you want to cover, or is it going to be water this year?
Yeah, sure. I'll say that. Water. If I could go back, man, I feel like we did our due diligence. We covered everything. We were spread a little thin. I think there are some things I covered that I would have liked to get even deeper on, even with like ballot measures, for example. But we wanted to make sure that we had a pretty comprehensive voter guide. And so I think we made the effort to cover a lot of ground, and we did that successfully.
Excellent. And Laura, I'm sorry, I lost track. Did you answer that question? What would you cover?
Yeah, mine was crypto.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm going to turn it back over to Mark. And having lived in San Francisco for years, I'm going to steal that, Camryn. The most liberal place to ever liberal. I wrote it down. Absolutely true. Thank you so much, everybody.
Indeed, yes. Well, that wraps things up for this evening. Thank you, everyone, for attending this evening. A special thanks to each of our great panelists for their time and their insights. I'm going to ask the panel just to stay online with us after the conclusion of the call, just for a quick wrap up just between us. As I mentioned, everyone at the outset, this event is being recorded, and we will post a recording in the near future. Access will be on our chapter website, phoenixspj.org. where you can find out a lot more information on our Phoenix SPJ chapter's activities. So for Tim Eigo and myself, I'm Mark Scarp. Thank you very, very much. And please have a terrific holiday season.